Tuesday hosted Kenyan leader Uhuru Kenyatta at the Union Buildings in Tshwane. Here to discuss this further, I'm joined now by the Deputy Director at the Africa Health Research Institute, Professor Thumbi Ndung'u, as well as Laura Lopez, Gonzalez, health journalist. Good evening. Thank you very much for your time. Laura, let's begin with you. The international platform, COVAX, how well is it doing in making sure that there's equitable distribution? Are there still challenges there?
There's definitely still challenges there. When you look at the vaccine distribution in the world, you see, great differences still between the global south and the global north. COVAX having to revise downward its projections of how many vaccines would be able to give the global south, many countries in Africa. This year, again, we've seen that 3 times being adjusted downwards as it struggles to get vaccines from manufacturers. Seth Berkley, who's the head of Gavi, and obviously Gavi hosting COVAX, pleading with manufacturers to be able to be more transparent with where they are in the pipeline for providing vaccines for COVAX, because COVAX itself can't really tell when vaccines are coming, and it's making it very difficult for countries on the continent to plan for that distribution.
Yeah, and what's the role that's played, for example, like countries like Germany, the US, and other Dutch countries, in particularly looking at the support for the African continent?
Right. So we're seeing people, the countries that you just mentioned, many of them had huge head starts in buying billions of doses of front-runner vaccines even before any hit the market or are proven to be effective. You see them retain this lead in vaccination as the pandemic continues. You see now that the United States, the European Union coming on board with donations. I think many activists would probably argue that that's a little late. The U.S. has made impressive sort of goals to donate money and to fund local manufacturing on the African continent. But I think this is really a moment that is really driving a conversation that's been happening on the continent for more than a decade about getting local manufacturing on the continent so that the continent can be more in control of its vaccine supplies.
Prof. Ndung'u, let's talk then about capacity for local manufacturing. President Cyril Ramaphosa and President Kenyatta going to visit the Aspen Pharma Care facility in Gqeberha. This is, I suppose, the first-hand experience that we have as a country as far as demonstrating capacity to produce vaccines. But what are the possible areas of cooperation with other countries within the continent?
Thanks very much. I think there's a lot of room for cooperation in manufacturing vaccines. We certainly need much more cooperation in terms of manufacturing capacity itself. Being able to produce vaccines requires good manufacturing practices, and I think that we don't have capacity for those kind of plants in most of sub-Saharan Africa. There are a few places, South Africa obviously being one of them, in Africa that can manufacture. But even in South Africa, the capacity is very limited to only a few facilities. Most African countries don't have the capacity for good manufacturing of vaccines. But I think even more than just manufacturing, I think it's the capability to actually do research and develop vaccines. Unless we are able to have that capacity to do the research and develop vaccines, we will always be behind because we will depend on others to avail the technology to us and basically pass on the technology for us to make the vaccines. So there is need for us to cooperate in terms of research and development, particularly in the fundamental research that is required in order to develop capacity for vaccine development, but also to do clinical trials and all the way to manufacturing.
Looking at the low number of vaccines that we do receive and that are available, are we using those effectively on the continent?
I think we are, definitely. I mean, the vaccines, wherever they have been in Africa, to the countries that have been able to get access to them, I think there has been a high uptake of vaccines. There is, of course, still some vaccine hesitancy, and there have been some problems in distribution in some sub-Saharan African countries. But I think the most problems in Africa, as far as vaccines, COVID vaccines are concerned, have been in getting access to the vaccines. In the cases where countries have gotten access to the vaccines, they have actually been able to distribute them to their to people in those countries. So I think at the moment, in most sub-Saharan African countries, we have to say that the problem has been access rather than vaccine hesitancy. Although, of course, there is also the problem of vaccine hesitancy in some cases.
And if we look at, for example, the availability of vaccine, Laura, that we have right now, what are the reports telling us? I mean, how far will they take us, and when are we likely going to run out?
Right. So in South Africa, supply is not an issue. It's really about getting that uptake. So, that ambitious target that we heard in the beginning of the sort of in the rollout, targeting 70% of adults by the end of the year. It looks more like we're going to hit about 50% or half of adults. So really, I think government's really taking out all the pulling out all the stops, putting vaccines onto innovative sort of transport. You've seen that on the Transnet trains. The Vuma vaccination weekend's a big push to try to really figure out whether this is hesitancy. People may be having questions about the vaccines, which we know are safe and effective, or whether it's about logistical hurdles for many people who have to pick between perhaps queuing for a vaccine or, putting food on the table that day.
Yeah. The big question, of course, is always around this thing of waning of the effectiveness of the vaccine, and whether we will be able to continually have access to more, but also there's a conversation around booster shots now, or is it too early for the continent to even begin to be thinking about that?
I think we've heard recently in many health department briefings that most people on the continent haven't had a first shot. So for the continent, it is very premature. I think many scientists have said to begin thinking about boosters when many countries are really just trying to get those first and second shots in there. But I think that does speak to some of the initiatives that are happening in Cape Town and throughout the country to begin manufacturing locally of that mRNA vaccine, because as you said, we're going to be needing COVID-19 vaccines into the foreseeable future is what scientists seem to be saying, and Prof. Ndung'u is probably a better place to talk about that. But the idea there is not only to make a homemade mRNA vaccine, but really to be able to do all the processes of production so that we're not reliant on, for instance, China and India for some of those consumables and some of those early ingredients for vaccines that we know were in short supply as supply chains were disrupted by this pandemic.
What role then, Prof, quickly, can the development corporations play here? Because, I mean, the assumption is that the vaccines do wane in time, and therefore you need to go and kind of refresh. So you need a continuous supply.
Absolutely. And I think this is going to be a major issue going forward. I think most of the studies are pointing to the fact that the immunity that is induced by the vaccine, or immunity that is even induced by natural infection, is short-lived for COVID, for SARS-CoV-2. In other words, it's unlikely that, at least at the moment, that these vaccines are going to give long-lasting immunity that lasts more than 9 months or up to 1 year. So there is absolutely need for us to continue research into development, because the fact that the current vaccines that we have are only able to induce short-lived immunity doesn't mean that that's going to always be the case. What we should be doing actually is to do research and see how can we modify the current vaccines so that we could have immunogens or vaccines that are able to induce long-lasting immunity. So this calls for continuous research and for patients on the part of the public, but also investment from the governments and from all sectors of society, so that we have manufacturing capability to ensure that we continue to have supplies for vaccines, because I don't see any other way out of this pandemic at the moment.
Prof, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Thumbi Ndung'u, Deputy Director of the Africa Health Research Institute, as well as Laura Lopez, Gonzalez, Health Journalist.